Hi, this is Fred with Quality One Engravers. I'm going to discuss a couple things about inline, outline, and doing tool paths. I'm going to start with just some text, just the letter A, B, C. I'm going to swipe through it to give it an outline font. All fonts, just pick this one will be good. And I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger. This is approximately 1 3/4 inches high, and let's say this is what I need to cut out. Of course, I need to end up with the parts looking exactly like this when I'm all done. So if I am going to engrave these, I will select these, click on engrave, create a tool path, and I'm going to do a fill. And I'm going to select a cutter up here. Since they're 1 3/4 inches, I'm going to select something. Maybe I'll use a 60 cutter. And I'm not going to cut 1/4 inch deep, so I'm going to maybe cut 30 thousandths deep, maybe even 20, and I'm going to do it in one pass. Let's say it's plastic, and because it's a 60 cutter, I'm going to make it P60. This is just my own preference. You could make it 20 for the depth, but I like putting P60, and it reminds me next time when I do this job. I like using the sweep tool down, and usually an overlap of 30% is pretty good. Don't worry about the inlays. This is for doing things like puzzles. I also check mark the cut inline last. That way it does the little trimming cut at the end. And I click on OK. Now, if I were to look at this and I'm going to hit the hotkey Alt-N, and what I just did is under View, I just show tool diameter, or View, turn off show tool diameter. So this is how it is going to engrave. Now this is a real thin letter, and probably I would have used a different tool path on this particular letter. But you can see if I go Alt-N, this is the actual tool path that it is going to take, and you can see it actually is not going to get into some of these tight corners, which usually, again, is not a problem, especially on an 1 3/4 inch high letter. If you were to edit this tool path, if I go engrave, edit tool path, I can maybe say, okay, I want to use a 40 cutter, and then I'll change this to 40. Click OK. And now you can see that the radius from my tool has made less of an effect, but you can see on certain parts of the letter it is pretty predominant. Okay, so that's how I would engrave this letter. So now I'm going to Control Z, cancel. I'm going to hold the Alt key down and click. Now if I go to engrave this, the only thing that I want to engrave is just the tool path. I do not want to engrave the exterior, because if I engrave the exterior, it will make this letter bigger. So if you can imagine here, if I go Alt-N, here's how big it's going to be when I engrave it. But if I take a circle, and I'm going to make this 02 diameter, this will be this is the path that it takes. There's your cutter right here. Now let's see. I must have used a little bit bigger cutter. This is 04. Let me click here. Engrave, edit tool path. Let's see. I used an 040 cutter. So this would be double the size, 200. And here's the cutter. Well, it's still I know. The reason that it has a different shape here is because the conical shape of the tool is being compensated for. So let me just go ahead and draw this the exact size. Okay, so there's the cutter. Now if I were to grave this tool path, as you can see, this is what I would end up with. is a letter that is much thicker than what I actually want. Okay, so I don't want to do that. I only want to select just the toolpath. So if I always use this little trick, if I want to get an A in the class, I hold the Alt key down and click on the number 40 or the P40, and now that is the only tool that I can select. You can play around with the Alt and the Control key to add and subtract other layers that you have here in the job palette. So now when I go to engrave, this is the only thing that I can plot out. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to delete it, and yes, that's fine. And then Alt and click on the number 1. Now I want to cut out these letters. So I go to engrave, create a toolpath, and this time I want to do a male. I always think of males as being bigger than the females, so I click on male, and maybe in this case I'm going to use an end mill. So I'm going to pick out, probably for this high a letter, I would use maybe an 093 end mill, and maybe it's 1/16 of an inch, and I'm going to do it in 1 or 2 passes. I'll leave it at 2 passes. I'm going to change this to 093. And now this is the direction of how it is going to cut. Most cutting that you're going to do where you want to is going to be climb cutting. So this is the direction of the tool, and as it goes around, it's climbing up the exterior. And if you're cutting the wrong direction, you will see that your letter or your cutout piece is in better or worse condition than your original. So now you can see that right here, this is the inline, so you can see that it automatically did an inline here and an outline on the outside. So what you end up with, if I go Alt N, you'll see that this is the shape that it will cut. And of course, depending on the size of the tool, you'll see this little radius in here. Now, let's say that, and if you look real close, of course, up at the top of the A, you may want to select a smaller tool so you do get further up into this portion of the A. Now, this is a very thin font, so it's dramatized considerably. Now, let's say that I delete this, and let's say that these, I'm going to go under here to engrave, break apart. So now all of these pieces are all separate pieces. They're no longer connected, and Engravelab has no clue which parts are for which. So what happens is if I go to this part here and I tell it I want to engrave this, and maybe I do want this letter B with this triangle in it, if I go to engrave, create a toolpath, if I go male again and say OK, you can see that it went to the outside on the outside of the B, but it also went, if I go Alt N, you can also see it went to the outline of the triangle in the middle, making it smaller. Well, that isn't what I want, so I'm going to delete that. And this time I'm going to, some programs call it combine, Engravelab calls it, where is it, make path, or Control H. I usually just remember the hotkey, which is Control H. And I'm going to go to engrave, create toolpath, male, and use the same tool and say OK. And now you can see that it has gone to the other side, and you will end up with the proper size. Now let's say that you're cutting this C. Let's say you're doing a stencil and you're cutting this letter C out of something. You would go engrave, create toolpath, and now I want to do a female. Females are smaller, and I'm going to use the same tool. I'm going to go 060 deep. I'm going to do it in 2 passes. A lot of times I like clicking on 2 so I get these to equal. Say OK, and again I'm going to come down here and select my 93, tell it OK, and now this is what it is going to be cutting. Now, as you can imagine, when I click on this and I go engrave, edit toolpath, this is going the opposite direction. So it is going counterclockwise for a slot, so it will be cutting the outside in a climb cutting motion. If you have any other questions, give me a holler or let me know what you didn't understand on this.